In 218 BC, Rome sent a man into the most dangerous city on earth. His name was never recorded. His mission was never officially acknowledged. And when Carthage finally fell, Rome never went looking for him. Imagine being that man. No army behind you, no weapon at your side, no one who knows your real name. Your mission is simple: watch, listen, and report back. But here's the thing nobody told you before you left. Some missions don't have a way home. This is the story of the men Rome sent into Carthage, the ones history barely remembers, the ones who disappeared into the most powerful rival city in the ancient world and never came back. And what they sacrificed changed the fate of two civilizations. To understand this story, you need to understand one thing. Rome and Carthage didn't just dislike each other, they feared each other. For over a century, these two civilizations fought three of the most brutal wars the ancient world had ever seen. Historians call them the Punic Wars. But that name doesn't capture what they actually were. They were a fight for survival, a fight for the right to exist. Carthage sat on the northern coast of Africa, in what is now Tunisia. It was rich, it was powerful. It had a navy that ruled the Mediterranean, and it had generals so skilled, so brilliant, that even Rome's greatest commanders studied them for generations. The most famous of those generals was Hannibal Barca, a man who crossed the Alps with war elephants, a man who brought Rome to its knees, a man who, for 15 years, walked across Roman soil and destroyed everything in his path. And at the height of Hannibal's campaign, at the moment Rome was closest to total collapse, one Roman senator stood up and began saying something that would echo through history. His name was Cato the Elder. And every single speech he gave, regardless of the topic, regardless of the occasion, ended with the same sentence: Carthago Delenda Est. Carthage must be destroyed. He said it after debates about farming, after discussions about road construction, after speeches about taxation and trade and the price of grain. Every time, without fail, Carthago Delenda Est. But what Cato never said, not once in any of those speeches, was how Rome actually learned enough about Carthage to destroy it. That story was never told publicly. And it begins with a man we will call Marcus. Marcus was not a general, not a senator, not a man whose name would be carved into stone. He was a soldier turned observer, fluent in 3 languages, calm under pressure in a way that made his commanders uncomfortable, because that kind of calm only comes from having been afraid so many times that fear becomes familiar. He had grown up near the Italian coast, which meant he knew boats. He knew trade routes. He knew how to become the kind of man that busy harbor cities ignore. A merchant, a middleman, a nobody moving cargo from one place to another, which made him exactly the kind of man Rome needed. Because Rome had a system, informal, quiet, almost invisible, of men who were sent ahead, into enemy cities, into foreign courts, into places where a Roman face could get you killed. They weren't called spies. Rome didn't use that word. They were called speculatores, scouts, observers. But what they did went far beyond scouting a hillside. These were men who learned foreign languages, who changed their names, who memorized cover stories so deeply that they sometimes forgot who they actually were. And Rome needed them desperately. Because here is something that tells you exactly how dangerous Rome's situation was in those years. When the First Punic War began, Rome had almost no navy, no warships, no naval tradition whatsoever. Carthage, on the other hand, had dominated the Mediterranean for generations. Their sailors were the best in the world. Rome should have had no chance at sea. But then, a Carthaginian warship ran aground on an Italian beach. And rather than simply studying it, Rome reverse-engineered the entire vessel, built 100 copies, and trained their soldiers to row on dry land before a single ship even touched water. They did all of this in roughly 60 days. That is the kind of people Rome was. Relentless, adaptive, willing to learn from the very enemy trying to destroy them. And that same hunger to understand the enemy, to get inside them, is what put Marcus on a boat headed toward the most dangerous city in the world.
He left the Italian coast on a small trading vessel, not a warship. That would draw attention. A merchant boat carrying oil and cloth. Something ordinary, something forgettable. He was dressed as a trader. He had a name that was not his name. He had a story about where he came from and why he was making this crossing. He rehearsed it in his mind for the entire voyage. There was a single Roman coin he had pressed into the sole of his sandal before he left. An old one, small, practically worthless. He knew he should have left it behind, but some things you cannot bring yourself to do. The Mediterranean in the 2nd century BC was not a peaceful body of water. Pirates operated in open daylight. Storms could swallow a ship in hours, and the sea routes toward Carthage were watched, because Carthage controlled much of the western Mediterranean and knew exactly who was sailing through their waters. If he was stopped and searched, there was nothing on him to betray his mission. No documents, no maps, no letters. Everything he needed to know, he carried in his memory. That was deliberate, because a document can be found, a letter can be read, but what is inside a man's mind? That takes longer to extract. When the coast of Africa finally came into view, it was breathtaking. Carthage rose from a peninsula that jutted into the sea like a hand reaching outward. Its harbor was one of the engineering wonders of the ancient world, a circular military port built within a larger commercial harbor. At its center stood the Admiral's Tower, with windows that looked out over every single ship. Up to 220 warships could sit inside that harbor at once, and from the open sea, you couldn't see a single one. The entire fleet, hidden in plain sight. That single detail, standing on the deck of a merchant boat as the city came into focus, would have told Marcus everything he needed to know about what he was walking into. Carthage did not show you what it had. It waited for you to find out. He pressed his foot down against the coin in his sandal and stepped ashore. Carthage was not what Rome's propaganda said it was. Roman citizens were told the city was barbaric, cruel, a place of dark rituals and cold blood, a place worthy only of destruction. But walking its streets for the first time, Marcus would have felt something Rome had not prepared him for, something close to awe. Carthage was magnificent, and that magnificence was its own kind of danger. Its streets were wide and carefully planned. Its buildings rose 6 and 7 stories high. The smell of the markets hit you before you could see them. Spices from sub-Saharan Africa, purple dye from the Phoenician coast, silver from Spain, grain from across the sea. The city felt like the entire world had been compressed into one place. But Marcus could not afford to be a tourist, because the same diversity that gave him cover also gave Carthage its eyes. A city full of merchants from every corner of the known world is also a city full of people whose survival depends on knowing who belongs and who doesn't. Every transaction in that market was also an assessment. Every greeting at the city gates was also a test.
What language do you default to when you're startled? What god do you swear by when something goes wrong? Do you hesitate over food that is unfamiliar? Small things, tiny things. But in a city that had been at war with Rome for generations, a city where Roman soldiers had killed Carthaginian fathers and sons, small things could end you completely. Marcus had been there 3 weeks when it nearly happened. A merchant in the harbor district, a man who traded in tin from the northern seas, looked at him a moment too long, asked a question about his route that was one question too many. Marcus answered slowly, calmly, the way a man answers when he has nothing to hide. The merchant nodded, moved on. Marcus walked to the far end of the dock, looked out at the hidden fleet, and did not move for a long time. The coin in his sandal felt very far from home.
Here is the cruel irony of intelligence work in the ancient world. The better you were at your job, the more dangerous your situation became. To gather real information, not just market gossip, not just rumor, you needed access. Access required trust. Trust required time. And time meant exposure. Every additional day in Carthage was another day something small could go wrong. There were Carthaginian agents in this world too, men whose entire job was to find people exactly like Marcus. And Carthage was deeply paranoid, rightfully so. They had caught Roman operatives before. What happened to those men, history records only vaguely. Vaguely is enough to understand. There is a documented account, referenced by the Roman historian Livy, of Roman spies captured during the Second Punic War. Some were returned with their hands cut off as a message. Some simply disappeared into Carthaginian prisons and were never mentioned again. Rome was watching Carthage, and Carthage was watching Rome watch them. But here is what made Marcus's situation almost unbearable. He knew what was happening back home. Word travels slowly, but it travels, and by the time it reached him, filtered through merchants and sailors and whispered conversations in harbor taverns, he understood what Hannibal had done at Cannae. In 216 BC, Hannibal had lured the Roman army into a trap on an open field in southern Italy. What followed was perhaps the single worst military defeat in Roman history. In one single afternoon, Hannibal killed somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Roman soldiers. Historians believe that was roughly 1 in 5 adult male Romans alive at the time. Let that land for a moment. 1 in 5. And the Roman Senate, terrified of total social collapse, responded by banning public mourning. They restricted the grieving period to 30 days. They forbade women from weeping in the streets. A civilization that had just lost 1 in 5 of its men told the survivors to be quiet about it. That is the Rome Marcus was risking his life for. Not a Rome of invincible glory, a Rome that was bleeding out. A Rome so desperate it was sending lone men into enemy cities and praying they came back with something useful. Knowing that, truly knowing how close Rome was to annihilation, must have made the silence of his work feel almost impossible to carry. He had information Cato himself would have wanted, but there was no one to tell it to. Not yet. Over months, and for some operatives, years, the intelligence accumulated. The harbor capacity, the condition of grain stores, the deep political tension between Carthage's military commanders and the merchant aristocracy, men who had grown wealthy from trade and were quietly terrified that the wars Hannibal was fighting would eventually destroy the commerce that fed them.
the fragility of Carthage's alliances with the Numidian kingdoms to the west, the names of officials who could be bribed, the routes through the city that were least watched at night. None of this came from maps or documents. It came from men like Marcus, from conversations in taverns, from relationships built over months with people who trusted him, people who, if they had known the truth, would have had him killed before sunrise. He had been inside that city for 2 years, and Rome had no idea if he was still alive. That was the arrangement. That was always the arrangement. There was no extraction plan. Rome did not send ships to collect you. There was no signal fire, no prearranged route home. If you survived long enough, you found your own way back to the coast. And if you didn't, Rome moved on. There are names in the historical record that flicker once and disappear. A man mentioned in a single dispatch, never mentioned again. An agent whose information proved accurate, but who was never seen after delivering it. These were not recorded as losses. They were simply gaps. And back in Rome, Cato kept giving his speeches. Carthago Delenda Est. Carthage must be destroyed. He never said by whom it had already been entered. He never said whose silence had made the strategy possible. He spoke of Carthage as a problem to be solved, never as a place where Roman men had quietly bled for years. That silence was its own kind of answer about what Rome thought of the men it used. Carthage fell in 146 BC. After the Third Punic War, Rome didn't just defeat the city, it erased it. The buildings were torn down stone by stone. The population was killed or enslaved. 50,000 survivors auctioned off within days of the walls coming down. And according to the famous account, salt was pressed into the earth so that nothing would ever grow there again. A civilization that had stood for over 600 years, gone in a single season. Rome had won. The Roman general who commanded the final siege, Scipio Aemilianus, reportedly stood in the ruins as the city burned and wept. When his officers asked him why, he said he was thinking of Troy, of great cities that fall, of how nothing lasts forever. Some historians believe he was thinking of Rome itself, but no account records anyone asking about the men who might still have been inside when the legions came through the gates. No commander issued an order to find them. No record exists of anyone checking. No name was called out in the smoke and the rubble. Marcus does not appear in any record of that day. His war had ended long before the walls did. How? No one ever wrote down. But men like him were still inside when Rome came through the gates, living false lives in a city being unmade around them. For them, there was no signal. No warning, no one coming. Just the sound of Rome's victory and the silence where his name should have been. We will never know what happened to him, but we know this. The coin in his sandal, that small, foolish, human thing he could not bring himself to leave behind. If it survived at all, it survived unnoticed, uncelebrated, ground into the ash of a city that history decided to forget. Power does that. It asks for sacrifice without ever naming it as sacrifice. It sends people into the dark and calls it duty. Cato got what he wanted. Carthago Delenda Est. Carthage was destroyed. But the men who had walked inside it first, who mapped its secrets and carried its weight alone in the dark, were never given so much as an acknowledgement that they had existed at all. They were used and forgotten. This is not only a Roman story. Think about the people in your own life who work like Marcus worked. The parent who holds everything together quietly while everyone else sleeps.
the colleague who fixes problems before anyone notices they existed. The friend who shows up every single time and is somehow always the last person anyone celebrates. The ones doing the invisible, essential work. We live in a world that is very good at celebrating the general, the emperor, the name on the monument. We are far less good at seeing the ones in the shadows, keeping everything standing. Rome built an empire, and it was built, in part, by people it never acknowledged. 2,000 years later, the men who give the orders still get the monuments, and the ones who made those orders possible are still waiting for someone to say their name. So here is the question this story leaves you with. Not about Rome, not about Carthage, about right now. Who in your life is doing the invisible work? And when did you last tell them that you see them? This has been Lessons from History. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are people in your life who need to know they haven't gone unnoticed. And if you want to go deeper into the forgotten corners of the ancient world, subscribe. There are more stories waiting in the dark.